just a precursor, you may or may not hear a dog bark in the back. The neighbor kids are out biking, and my dog does not like that. So he is barking in the back. The other thing that I always tell parents before I usually start my story is I had an amazing childhood. I am still in this wonderful relationship with my parents. Like, nothing happened to like make this happen to me. There was no traumatic event. My parents weren't neglecting me or causing abuse. Like, nothing like that happened. And so I just want parents to know that before I tell my story. But it kind of goes back to when I was a sophomore in high school. I started to get this pain in my chest and a shortness of breath. And obviously, as a 16-year-old kid, I assumed I was having a heart attack, which was not true. But around that time, I don't know if you guys remember, like a few years ago, when a lot of those athletes were starting to have like the cardiac condition and would just like drop on a court and things like that. So that, like, my chest hurting started to happen around that time. And so we went into the doctor to get tested because this pain was not a good thing to be having. And so we did all these tests. I got tested for asthma and like all these different things. I had scans done of my heart, and it all came back clear. And a doctor who's actually a good family friend of ours told me that nothing was wrong with me. And that is one of the hardest things that I've ever had to hear. For a medical professional to tell you that despite the fact that sometimes you can't breathe and sometimes your chest hurts like a knife is digging into it, for a medical professional to say you're fine, it was really hard. And it made me feel pretty broken. And that brokenness made me stop telling anybody about what was going on. Part of it, I thought I'm fine, I'm normal, nothing's wrong with me. So I can't talk about these things that are happening, like, obviously I'm just making them up. And I don't know if you guys remember in the empathy video at all about, she kind of talked about this hole, right? Where like the little creature is there by herself for a little bit of time. And my reaction to the darkness of that hole for myself was to cover up the top of it and not let anybody near me ever, because I didn't want anybody in my life to ever have to see my darkness, feel how scary that hole is, or even know that that's where I spend my time. And so I used a lot of unhealthy coping skills. First of all, just kind of like bottling it up and just letting it be. And eventually I turned to self-harm and started cutting to try to get rid of these anxious feelings that just boiled up in me. But again, I was the kid that was gonna hide it and not let anybody ever see that. And so my scars are not visible. And honestly, if I hadn't have told anybody where they were at, they would have no idea. And so I did that for quite a few years until I was a junior in college. And that year, I had like dealt with some anxiety stuff leading up to that, and we kind of just figured by that point in time that it was anxiety, but never really diagnosed, and that sucked in of itself, because like you have a partial diagnosis but never like actually one. And so by the time that I was a junior, I was having panic attacks at least once a week. I had dug myself so far into a hole, and not even dug myself. I feel like I just kept falling further and further down. I didn't know if I could go any further. And I, for some reason, was hanging out with my mom, and she asked me, like, if I still had pain in my chest, or if I still, like, had that stuff going on. And I don't know what it was about it, whether it was God's timing or just me feeling like I couldn't go any further down by myself. I told my mom everything. And that was not easy to do, even talking about it, thinking back to that moment. It kind of feels like that moment when you pull a Jenga block out and everything crashes down. Yeah, it felt like that, except when you play Jenga with the big 2x4s, like you have to run, because if it starts to fall, it's gonna hit your feet, and it hurts when it hits your feet. It felt like that, like, careful, it's gonna hit your feet. And I told my mom about the anxiety, about the depression that had started to set in, and I told the person that was the most proud of me and that was my biggest supporter that I didn't want to live anymore, and that most of the time I couldn't think about moving forward. And she did not react the way that I thought she was going to. My mom sat and she listened, and she asked like some clarifying questions, and then she was ready to be there, and be my mom. And that conversation started a whole thing. Like, obviously things aren't fine and dandy when you finally tell somebody that something's happened. Like, you are lying to yourself, fooling yourself if you think like all of a sudden things are great because you've said the thing that hurts you. No, it's a great first step, but like things still suck afterwards. And actually I got to a point where that next summer I was having panic attacks every single day, several times a day sometimes. And those panic attacks, if you've never had one before, or maybe you have, but for myself, it was on the ground, like shaking, or my body felt like concrete had been poured into it and I couldn't move. My brain was still working, because that's the way that anxiety works, is my brain was still spinning, telling me to get up, I'm fine, like you're just being weak, or you're just not enough right now, you're making all of this up, but I couldn't get up. And that's not something that I would ever wish on my worst enemy. And I've had some pretty painful people in my life, but I would never wish them to have that feeling, because it is a pretty helpless feeling. But because of that conversation that I had with my mom, she was the one that I called after those panic attacks. And I always sometimes kind of forget to like mention my dad, but my dad currently works at the 211 Helpline Center, and he had started that at the beginning of college. And so he knew the questions to ask when I brought this up. He still knows the questions to ask when I mention it. And so even he would be one of my calls. My mom was just somebody easier to talk to. But my dad was always that person that like, no questions asked, hug. And my love language is physical touch. And so he knew that was the best way to calm me down or help me. And so after the period of time of having lots of panic attacks all the time, I started on medication, which was a really hard pill to swallow, because I viewed medication as like, I'm the kind of girl, like, I'm gonna pull myself up by my bootstraps, I'll be fine. Like, if I get hurt, like I played rugby in college, if I got hurt, like I was just gonna pull the sock up over the injury, I'll be fine. But having to take medication every day was not something that I saw myself ever having to do. But eventually, it was explained to me, and like I kind of came to the conclusion of myself that my brain doesn't work quite like it should have, like making the chemicals happen that need to happen in order for it to stay functional. And actually, I also found out during that time that I have hypothyroidism. And so not only were my hormones off since I was a sophomore in high school, because they looked back at my labs, but because they were off, not because, there are a lot of other things that probably led up to it, but like that also played a factor in all these things. And so I started on medication, and now I'm a big advocate for people who maybe think they need that to help balance themselves out. Some people need it for just a short amount of time to get through a life circumstance. And for myself, I'm going on 3 years now of taking anxiety and depression meds. Something that, like Angela was talking about being an advocate, something that was really helpful in that, like going to the psychiatrist and things like that. When I would take a purely depression med, my anxiety would ramp up. But if I took an anxiety med, my depression would ramp up. And so finally I was able to talk about that with my doctor, and they started me on both, which like, what? God forbid. So when they started on both, that was so helpful. And now I've gotten to the point where like, I can advocate enough for myself that this last winter, when I met with my psychiatrist before like seasonal depression set in, I told him, I think we should start like a higher dosage of my depression med, but only for 3 months. Like, I don't think I need it past the spring because the sun will be out again. And that was true. Like, I only needed it for those 3 months. But it took a long time for me to learn the words to say that and learn the confidence to be able to advocate for myself. Because I'm not gonna lie, when I started all of this, of like looking back into my childhood and realizing I think I had depression and anxiety starting when I was like early middle school. I had no idea it was any of that. I had no idea what was normal. I didn't know that people didn't stay up most of the night worrying about things. Like, I just thought everybody else did that. And so I know that my parents were told like, hey, maybe Jordan has this, and they were looking for the red flags. So all of those things that you talked about, like, for some reason I thought like, I can't show anybody any of those things. And they were never enough that like my parents thought anything wrong. And it really was true until I hit a point in my life where I was an adult and they were starting to ramp up into those things where like, yep, this is a mental health condition. But I never learned the language of being able to advocate for myself and being able to say, like, reaching out, it's not a weakness. It's not just being ignorant or being dramatic. It is, sorry, he thinks he's tough. It's an act of strength. And if there's anything that I teach kids as much as possible, it's that like saying that something's not right or that you're not okay. And when I say I teach kids, I mean everybody that I talk to. I try to explain if something's enough that it's bothering you, it's enough to talk about it and try to work on it because it shouldn't be bothering you anymore. God, I'm so sorry. So thank you for listening to my story and listening to my sort of tears. It's been a very long day, so thank you for bearing with me on all of that.